Hi, my name is Shree and I am talking to you on behalf of the orthotic and prosthetic industry, and I am representing NCOPE, which is the National Commission on Orthotic and Prosthetic Education, as I am the current marketing director and I've had the pleasure of serving on the HPW Planning Committee this past year. So you're going to hear me say O and P quite a few times, and the O represents orthotics while the P represents prosthetics. It's a short form. So while there's many acronyms, that's also how I feel about the many hats that I've worn in my decade plus in the orthotic and prosthetic industry. I've had the sheer pleasure of working with a tremendous amount of incredible mentors and patients, colleagues, and honestly, even teaching students from a wide range of marketing, which is what I currently do, all the way to fabrication and patient care, volunteer programs, manufacturing, insurance reimbursement, kind of the whole gamut. And the reason I've done that has been very non-traditional, and it has given me insight into many of the unique positions and career paths that exist within the O&P industry, many of which are often lesser known until you enter the industry. So for me, it gave me hands-on experience, and I'll be walking you through several of the positions I've held and the incredible companies I've had the chance to work with and work for. And then if there's any questions, please feel free to contact me via HPW or NCOPE. My email is sfaker@ncope.org, and you can find us across our social media at NCOPE. So how did I get interested in O&P and what started this career? So I was a military kid, and I grew up from a very young age watching people with various disabilities redo their lives in different ways, adapting and learning what's next. And especially that applied to military service members, having grown up around the world and seeing how they adjust to kind of the world around them. And I knew I wanted to work with that in some way, shape, or form. Fast forward through high school and college, I had taken many engineering courses, was even an engineering major at one point. And then I switched into sciences because I felt like engineering lacked that mixture of sciences. So that's one thing. And then secondly, it was also, I wanted to work with my hands. So I spent the first few years after graduating from undergrad, instead of going directly into orthotics and prosthetics, the master's programs, and continuing my education, I wanted the hands-on experience of, well, how do you build these devices? What kind of devices are there? How do you treat a patient who comes into the hospital for their pre-op, so before their operation, before their amputation, if it's a planned one? What are the causes for amputations? And kind of what are the orthotics? Because for a long time, I didn't know what orthotics really were and what they did. But it's a lot of different things like AFOs, which are ankle foot orthoses. It's also back bracing. So it's TLSOs, so thoracic lumbar orthotic. And it covers a large portion, and I'll tell you a little later about why a TLSO became something that I really came to understand and appreciate orthoses for. So I worked in inpatient rehab. So it was a physical rehab center, met with a doctor who was absolutely amazing. She was a physiatrist who specializes in physical rehab, and she was primarily working with individuals who had amputations, diabetes, kind of the whole gamut of complications that result in long-term hospital stays many times, and all of the comorbidities that people have when they're coming into the hospital with long hospital stays. So it was a really great opportunity. I did several kind of service trips, one in undergrad I had done with global medical brigades through my university, and then with this Dr. Lauren Shapiro, I had gone down to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we worked with diabetic patients who needed some kind of intervention, including amputation consults. And it was a great way for me to learn, this is everything that happens prior to the actual prosthetics and orthotics get involved. And you have things like stroke that cause drop foot, and drop foot results in kind of like your foot hanging forward. So instead of being able to pick up and walk like a normal gait pattern, instead you have something that like your toes are basically getting caught. And there's a way to fix that, or at least to function better. And that's with AFOs. And that's just one example. And then you have like cranial helmets for especially like newborns who are born with some kind of cephalic deficiency or kind of growth deficiency, and it needs a little bit of remolding, shaping. It looks a little bit more intense than a bike helmet, picture kind of like a skateboard helmet, but they're for babies. They're very custom designed, custom made, and then the shape kind of molds perfectly as it should, or as best as it can, right? And so those are various like things that I'd seen while working in the hospital setting, and then I moved to a clinic setting, a prosthetic an orthotic clinic setting. And that was where I got to be a technician, and I learned how to come up with the concept of like exactly what was the alignment going to be on a device and what kind of alignments did there exist, right? So if you have a below the knee amputation, and that means somewhere between your knee and your ankle, you have a below knee amputation, then you need your socket to be sitting properly so that way it can hold onto your residual limb, and then also for your legs to properly kind of balance between like your left and right, or if you have both limb loss on both sides of your feet, then you want it to match up so that way you have a proper gait alignment at your hips, because if not, you can cause further pain. So I learned all of these things. I loved it, and really I got to like elbows deep in plaster. I used to have rings that would just be covered in plaster for days and days. But it was a really amazing year of learning how to be in the workshop, in the lab, all of the different processes of fabrication. It was the plastics, the thermoplastics, and pulling them out of the oven and forming them to the molds, the plaster molds. And I loved that experience. And in the process, I had finally applied to grad school, gotten in, and I decided, hey, I don't want to move to Minnesota, because that was the only program I'd gotten into that year. And I looked for really a great opportunity, and I moved down to Ecuador, and I worked with a nonprofit that does international prosthetics and orthotics. I worked on everything from volunteer programs, expanded their trips from 2 per year, which was a cultural and educational exchange between American and Canadian prosthetists, orthotists, along with Ecuadorian and Guatemalan. And then it was building, treating patients, exchange of resources, education, clinics. It was a really great combination. So it wasn't a flyover mission, but it really taught me kind of the value of exchange of information. And I did that, ran the devLab, which was a lot of like 3D printing, and saw patients where we were trying to get them to like their next phase. They were running for the first time, they were walking for the first time, they were swimming for the first time, a lot of that. And then this was all at high altitude or in extremely dry temperatures, or dry heat and high temperatures in the desert. Kind of a wild combination of you have access to resources, but they're limited. So then it feels like there's a shortage in resources. And then that's where I found myself sitting at these round tables where we were discussing kind of the future of what does disability healthcare look like? How do we support disability in a more kind of cohesive way? What resources are needed? What's lacking? How do we like increase the access to resources, access to care, access to sufficient care, where a person can do what they want, not necessarily just based off of what's available, right? How do they learn about these resources? And I felt that instead of adding myself to the list of amazing clinicians that there are, I would rather tackle the policy side. So I went from that into a master's program for global health policy, which has been totally online pre-COVID. COVID wrecked us, as I think most people can understand. But what was really great about it was I worked full time, continued gaining experience, working with incredible companies. And I was in school for basically gaining some validity and more education on becoming an expert in this kind of hybrid of, what does disability access look like and how do we improve upon that, especially in resource poor areas such as rural versus urban and developing countries versus developed countries, and then kind of breaking that down in a few layers. So it's, very different than what I had intended, very different than what I planned, but also it was a matter of I was taking what I was learning and going to the next thing, taking what I was learning and going to the next thing, taking what I was learning and going to the next thing, which is what I can, encourage anyone and everyone as they're seeking a job or a career, especially, and in healthcare. These were only some of the things that stood out to me in what I did. So from there, I started working a lot on the marketing and the social media and the storytelling side of things, because I learned very quickly there is a need for stories to be told. And from there, I worked with a manufacturing company where we designed and developed and brought to market the very first prosthetic hand that gave you touch sensitivity. And that was a really incredible experience. And that was several years of working with patients and teaching clinicians how to find the best candidate and how to fit them and what was the training that was required, and then working on the insurance reimbursement, because insurance has this weird clause that applies to all healthcare where is it medically necessary. And so the medically necessary term is pretty outdated, but a lot of people don't know that disability can happen at any time, right? And because of that, I have all of these different insights of the experiences and all of the roles that are played in getting a patient the device that they need, and then them being able to use that device to the best of their ability. So my appreciation comes for this industry when I actually experienced a really weird freak fall where I fell about 15 feet while indoor bouldering and ended up with a spinal fracture. And while I've completely healed and recovered from it, there's a lot to be said about when the recommendation for one option for recovery from my trauma surgeon was a TLSO, a back brace, that was actually referred to the clinic that I worked at the time. So it's weird and funny how everything kind of comes full circle always. And in that moment, I realized kind of the value of the career I was in and the industry I was working in, because it became a very personal thing. I had been working in it very diligently. I really enjoyed what I was doing, the people that I came across, and the stories that changed the way I thought about healthcare and the access and what was missing and what was so cool about it. I mean, you get to be building things with your hands. It's a form of art, honestly. And then I was sitting as the patient in one of those offices. And so I have learned that there's a lot that this industry offers, which is honestly very lesser known. And so that is where I will leave you today. And I encourage you to explore the field of orthotics and prosthetics because it's a really cool one in all things healthcare.